You have probably flown on an older airplane without giving it a thought. A design that should have retired years ago, still in the air because it passed every check on paper. Until one day, it doesn't. This video is about the moments when luck runs out, and invisible fractures finally tear through an aging airframe. Most you never heard of. Don't forget to subscribe. In 1952, the future arrived wearing British colors. The de Havilland Comet was the first jet airliner the world had ever seen, and it flew twice as high and twice as fast as anything else in the sky. Passengers sipped their drinks at 40,000 feet in near silence while propeller airliners crawled along far beneath them. To a nation still rebuilding from the war, the Comet was proof that Britain could lead the world again. What almost no one understood was that the same airplane carried a flaw written into its bones, a flaw that would tear it apart at the height of its glory. The pride of the fleet was a Comet that had already made history, the very aircraft that flew the world's first scheduled jet service. On the 10th of January 1954, it sat at Rome's Ciampino Airport as Flight 781, on the last leg of a long journey from Singapore. 29 passengers and 6 crew settled in for the flight to London. The plane lifted off, turned up the Italian coast, and began its steady climb toward 36,000 feet. Everything about it was routine. As the Comet passed 26,000 feet, the captain traded a few words by radio with a piston-powered airliner flying the same route below him. He was describing the cloud conditions ahead. In the middle of a sentence, his voice cut out. His next word never came. At that instant, climbing through about 27,000 feet, the roof of the cabin tore open. The aircraft depressurized in a heartbeat, ripping seats from the floor and flinging passengers against the structure. Within a second, the whole fuselage came apart. The tail folded away, the nose tore loose, and the wings split open and spilled their fuel into a fireball. What had been the most advanced airliner in the world fell toward the Mediterranean as a streak of fire. Fishermen near the island of Elba looked up at the sound and watched the flaming wreckage spiral down into the sea. All 35 people on board were lost. The loss made no sense. The Comet was Britain's pride, and it had simply exploded out of a clear sky. Some suspected an explosive device because nothing else seemed to explain it. BOAC quietly pulled its comets from service while engineers searched for answers. They drew up a long list of possible faults and made dozens of changes, hoping to fix whatever had gone wrong even though the wreckage still lay on the seabed. After 10 weeks, the modified comets were cleared to fly again. 2 weeks later, another one fell. This time, the airplane was carrying 21 people from Rome toward Cairo. It climbed away normally and was passing 35,000 feet when it broke apart in exactly the same way, scattering across the sea near Naples. The changes had done nothing. Whatever was destroying the Comet had not been touched, and now the world's first jetliner was grounded for good. With Britain's reputation on the line, the order came down that solving the mystery would cost whatever it took, in money and in effort alike. The answer came from a water tank. Investigators sealed a Comet fuselage inside it and filled it with water, then drained it over and over. Each cycle stood in for a single flight. After about 3,000 cycles, the hull split open with a dull pop. The crack had begun at the corner of a cutout in the skin, then raced down the length of the fuselage. The metal had grown tired. Every time the cabin was pressurized for flight and relaxed again on the ground, tiny stresses gathered at the sharp corners of the windows and hatches, until one day the skin tore like paper. The Comet's makers had believed their fuselage would last for tens of thousands of flights. Both lost aircraft had failed in well under 1,500. The design had shaved the skin thin to save weight, and the real stress crowding into those corners turned out to be far higher than the engineers had ever calculated. An earlier test had fooled them. The sample they had pushed to high pressure beforehand was quietly toughened by the process, so it lasted far longer than any normal Comet could. They had proven their airplane safe using the one fuselage that was not. And here the version most people remember gets the details wrong. People still say the Comet fell because its windows were square, but they never were. The real culprit was a skin too thin and a science too young to see the danger hiding in plain sight. The Comet never recovered. By the time a safer version flew, Boeing and Douglas had claimed the jet age for themselves. Most of the disasters in this video were caused by metal that failed. This one was different. The Hawker Siddeley Trident did not break, corrode, or come apart in the sky. It did exactly what it was built to do. The trouble was that the Trident was built with a hidden trap, a single lever that could stall the airplane in an instant, and a safety system the crew could switch off with one pull of a handle. In the summer of 1972, all of it came together over a quiet English town, and 118 people paid the price in about 2.5 minutes. The Trident was the pride of British aviation. a sleek three-engined jet that crews loved to fly. But in 1972, the airline that flew it was at war with itself. Younger pilots wanted to strike for better pay and conditions, while the older generation stood firmly against them. The argument had turned personal and bitter. The captain of this flight was one of the loudest voices opposing the strike, a hard man with little patience, and someone had even scrawled insults about him on equipment in the cockpit. He was 51 years old, with 15,000 hours behind him, and he carried a secret that even he did not know. Inside his arteries, fatty deposits had been narrowing the blood vessels around his heart for years. No medical exam had ever caught it. About 90 minutes before takeoff, he got into a furious argument over the strike in the crew room at Heathrow. Doctors later concluded that the surge in blood pressure most likely tore the lining of one of his damaged arteries. It would not kill him outright, but it would have caused a slow and building pain, the kind that wrecks a person's focus without ever forcing them to stop. British European Airways Flight 548 lifted off from Heathrow in the late afternoon, with the ailing captain at the controls and a nervous 22-year-old second officer beside him. From the start, the speed was wrong. The captain let the airplane fly slower than it should have, and as they climbed and pulled back the power to quiet the noise over the suburbs, the speed sank further still. The young co-pilot, fresh and unsure of himself, said nothing. He had just watched this captain tear into another pilot that very afternoon, and he was in no hurry to challenge him now. What happened next was never proven beyond doubt, because the Trident carried no cockpit voice recorder. But the evidence pointed to one terrible mistake. At about 1,800 feet, it appears the captain reached to bring in the flaps, a normal step at that stage of the climb. The flaps were already up, retracted moments earlier by the second officer. His hand most likely found the lever right beside it instead, the one that controlled the droops. Those were the high-lift surfaces along the front of the wings, the very things holding the slow airplane in the air. He pulled them in. In that instant, the wing could no longer support the Trident at its low speed, and the jet stalled with no warning at all. The Trident had a system designed for exactly this moment. As the wing stalled, alarms erupted and the control columns shook. An automatic device began pushing the nose down to gather speed and fly out of danger. It was working. It pushed once, then again, and then a hand in the cockpit pulled the override handle and shut it off. The crew did not believe the stall was real. They were flying inside cloud, and like many Trident pilots, they had grown to distrust that pushing device. So they switched off the one thing that could have saved them, and the airplane stopped fighting to live. Now nothing could stop it. The Trident hung in the sky for a few seconds, nose high and going nowhere, then dropped almost straight down toward the town of Staines. It missed a line of power cables by a hair and slammed into a field on the edge of the town. The cabin shattered on impact, though the tall tail came to rest almost untouched, standing in the grass as if the airplane had simply been set down there. About 2.5 minutes had passed since the wheels left Heathrow. All 118 people on board were lost. Britain's deadliest air disaster left investigators with almost nothing to work with. The Trident had no cockpit voice recorder, because British law did not yet require one. The flight recorder told them the droops had been retracted too early, but it could not tell them why a seasoned captain would make such a basic error. The answer came from the autopsy. His narrowed arteries and the fresh tear in their lining pointed to a man flying in quiet agony, his judgment dulled at the very moment he needed it most. Beside him, a frightened young co-pilot stayed silent. What stung most was that the danger was already known. Twice before, Trident crews had retracted the droops too early and very nearly stalled, and each time the warning went nowhere. The airplane gave its pilots a lever they could pull at any speed, with nothing to stop them when pulling it would be fatal. It also let them switch off their own automatic rescue with a single handle. A sick captain and a silent cockpit sprang the trap that day, but the trap had been built into the machine, waiting. The lessons came too late for the 118. After Staines, Britain finally required every airliner to carry a cockpit voice recorder, so that investigators would never again be left guessing in the dark. And the Trident's droop lever was fitted with a simple lock, a device that would block a pilot from raising those surfaces when the airplane was flying too slow to survive without them. One small piece of metal, the kind that should have been there from the start, would have saved every soul on board. Some airplanes fail in ways engineers understand the moment they see the wreckage. This one failed in a way that no one on Earth could explain, and it took a second disaster and the deaths of nearly 100 people before anyone figured out why. In the late 1950s, the Lockheed Electra was supposed to be the future. It was a sleek, four-engined turboprop, faster and more powerful than anything in its class, and it was so heavily tested that to this day, It is remembered as one of the toughest airliners ever built. Lockheed had bent its wings until they snapped, slashed its fuselage, and battered it with axes and artificial storms. The Electra was, if anything, overbuilt. Airlines loved it, pilots loved it, and nothing about it suggested that it could simply come apart in calm air. On a clear September night in 1959, a brand new Electra took off from Houston as Braniff Flight 542, bound for Dallas and then on toward New York. The airplane was barely 2 weeks old. It had not even reached its first scheduled inspection. With 3 pilots, 3 flight attendants, and 28 passengers aboard, it climbed to 15,000 feet and leveled off in smooth, untroubled skies. At 7 minutes past 11, the crew made a routine radio call. It was the last anyone ever heard from them. 2 minutes later, people in the fields of rural Texas heard a strange, high-pitched scream tearing across the night sky, mixed with the grinding of metal. They looked up just in time to see a fireball bloom in the darkness, then break into burning streaks that fell to earth like shooting stars. All 34 people on board were gone. When investigators reached the scene, they found the airplane scattered across miles of countryside. The left wing had come off first, far from the main crater, and the rest of the Electra had followed it down in pieces. But the wreckage refused to tell its story. There was no fatigue in the metal, no sign of a tank explosion or sabotage. The weather had been calm. No other aircraft was near. Every break in the structure came from raw overstress, as if a giant hand had reached down and torn the wing clean off. They examined one strange detail, a propeller that seemed to have wobbled wildly in its mounting before the wing failed, but they dismissed it, assuming it had to have happened during the breakup rather than before. For months, they chased the mystery and got nowhere. By March of 1960, the investigators had all but given up, ready to file Braniff 542 as one of those crashes that would never be solved. And then, on the very day they were preparing to close the case, the unthinkable happened. A second Lockheed Electra fell out of the sky. A Northwest Orient flight cruising over Indiana lost its right wing in level flight and plunged into the ground at nearly the speed of sound, killing all 63 people aboard. 2 of the same brand new airplane breaking apart in midair, barely a year apart, could not possibly be coincidence. This time the wreckage gave up the answer, and it was stranger than anyone had imagined. The killer was a phenomenon called whirl mode. In simple terms, a spinning propeller behaves like a gyroscope, and if the structure holding it is damaged and weakened, the propeller can begin to wobble in a slow, widening circle instead of staying still. On most airplanes, that wobble fades away harmlessly, but on the Electra, as the wobble grew, it slowed to a rhythm that happened to match the natural vibration of the wing itself. The two began to feed each other, the way a child on a swing goes higher with every push. 3 times a second, the wing flexed harder and harder, until in 20 to 40 seconds it simply shook itself off the airplane. The plane was being killed by its own vibration. The reason both wings failed was buried in the design. The engine mountings were not quite stiff enough, so that once a hard landing or a jolt of turbulence weakened them, there was nothing left to tame the wobble before it turned deadly. It was a flaw so subtle that the world's most thoroughly tested airliner had carried it into service completely unnoticed, and it took 2 shattered airplanes to drag it into the light. In the end, Lockheed found the cure. They rebuilt the engine mountings far stronger, stiffened the wings, and proved with brutal testing that the modified Electra could no longer tear itself apart. The fixed airplane went on to a long and respected career, and its military cousin still flies into hurricanes to this day. But none of that helped the 97 people who died first. Some disasters arrive without warning. This one announced itself for weeks, and nobody listened. The airplane was a Boeing 737, 12 years old and worn down by a life of short and relentless flying. In the days before it fell, it had been quietly telling its crew that something inside it was failing. They heard the message. They simply did not understand what it meant. This Boeing had started life in 1969, flying for a major American carrier, before it was sold to Far Eastern Air Transport in Taiwan in 1976. There, it spent its days running quick domestic flights up and down the island, landing and taking off again and again. Every one of those flights mattered more than the calendar did. An airframe does not wear out by sitting in the sun. It wears out every time the cabin is pressurized for climb and relaxed again on the ground. And this one had been through that cycle more than 33,000 times. Hidden under the skin was a weakness the airplane had carried since the factory. The early Boeing 737s were built with their fuselage panels glued together along long seams called lap joints, a method meant to spread the stress of pressurization across the whole skin. On many of those early jets, the glue never bonded properly. Moisture crept into the gaps and corrosion ate at the metal. Tiny fatigue cracks began to spread along the rows of rivets. Boeing had warned operators about the problem years earlier. The cure was simple in theory. You had to find the cracks before they found you. For this airplane, that never happened. Just over 2 weeks before the end, it suffered a sudden loss of cabin pressure in flight and had to make an emergency landing. The warning could not have been clearer. Then on the morning of its final day, it tried to leave the ground and the same pressure problem returned, forcing the crew to turn back. Ground engineers looked it over, reset the system, and signed it off as fixed. A few hours later, it was loaded with passengers and sent back into the sky. The flight was a short domestic run from Taipei to Kaohsiung, carrying 104 passengers and 6 crew. It lifted off and began its climb, the cabin slowly pressurizing as it always did. Then, about 14 minutes after takeoff, the corroded seam beneath the forward cabin finally let go. A large piece of the lower fuselage tore away in an instant. The cockpit folded downward, the floor beams snapped, and the airplane came apart in the sky above the town of Sanyi. There was no time to call for help. The wreckage fell across the hills below, scattered over miles of countryside. All 110 people on board died. For a time, sabotage seemed the only possible answer, because a sound jet does not simply tear apart in calm air. Investigators searched the wreckage for any trace of an explosive device and found none. The truth, when it came, was both simpler and far more unsettling. The airplane had killed everyone on board with its own body. Years of corrosion and metal fatigue had eaten through the lap joints under the cabin. Exactly the weakness Boeing had cautioned about more than a decade before. The cracks had been growing for a long time, spreading unseen beneath the paint, and no inspection had ever caught them. When the cabin pressurized one last time, the weakened skin could no longer hold, and it unzipped in midair. What makes this loss so haunting is the number of cycles involved. This jet had flown far fewer flights than many others of its type still in service, which meant that older and harder worked airframes were flying around the world carrying the very same flaw. That is the quiet horror of an aging airplane. It does not announce its age the way a person does. The cracks hide beneath fresh paint while the corrosion spreads behind panels no passenger ever sees, and the machine looks as sound as the day it was built. Every pilot retracts the flaps after takeoff. It is one of the most ordinary actions in all of flying, a flick of a switch done 100 times a day without a second thought. On one Soviet-built airplane, that single ordinary action could shut down both engines at once. Nobody on board knew it, from the pilots up front to the 17 skydivers sitting on the bare cabin floor over the English countryside. In the summer of 1993, a Royal Air Force parachuting club needed an aircraft that could lift 17 jumpers off a grass field. Nothing in Britain fit the bill. So a broker went looking abroad and found a Hungarian outfit flying an old Soviet twin turboprop. The Antonov was an odd machine with a high wing and a twin tail, built in the final years of the Soviet Union. This one had lived a strange life. The paperwork around it was a mess. The plane was registered in 2 different countries at the same time, because no one had told the Russians it had moved to Hungary. To carry skydivers, its rear clamshell doors had been taken off completely so jumpers could leave in flight. There was just one problem. The Antonov had never been designed, tested, or approved to fly without those doors, and it had never been cleared for parachuting at all. On paper, it looked legal. In reality, the airplane was operating in a way its own makers would later call dangerous. None of that is what brought it down, though. For 2 days, the operation ran like clockwork. Take off from the grass, climb to the west, then swing back over the field and let the jumpers tumble out the open tail. Each round trip took about 15 minutes. 12 times the little Antonov went up and came back without a hitch. The 13th time was different. With 17 jumpers aboard and no one strapped in, the Antonov lifted off and started its climb. At around 500 feet, the captain called for flaps up, and his first officer flicked the electric switch, exactly as they had a dozen times already. In that instant, the airplane seemed to turn against them. Both propellers snapped into the feathered position and stopped pulling. Sensing the lost thrust, the system cut the fuel to both engines and threw up the spoilers on both wings. In the space of a heartbeat, the Antonov lost its power and most of its lift, all from the simple act of raising the flaps. The captain had seconds to act. He shoved the nose down to hold his speed, knowing that if he pulled up, the airplane would stall and drop out of the sky. There was no height to make it back to the runway, and the ground below was scattered with trees and ditches and roads. He picked the one thing that might work, a field of freshly cut corn stubble off to the right. There was no time for a warning, and the jumpers had no belts to hold them in any case, so they braced against each other and the bare floor. Moments later, the Antonov slammed down into the field at about 92 knots, nose high and banked slightly to the right. The landing gear folded instantly, and both wings bent down into the dirt. But the fuselage held together, and the airplane ground to a stop on its belly. Every single person on board had survived, and not one of them was seriously hurt. And with the rear doors already gone, the jumpers were out and standing in the stubble before anyone called for an evacuation. British investigators expected a simple wrap-up. What they found instead was one of the strangest design flaws ever built into an airplane. Deep in the Antonov's wiring, the circuit that moved the flaps and the circuit that feathered the propellers shared a single grounding point, held to the airframe by one small screw. Over years of vibration, that screw had slowly worked itself loose. Once it was loose enough, the current meant for the flaps could no longer take its normal path, so it jumped across into the feathering circuit instead and ordered both propellers to feather. One loose screw was all it took to turn a routine flap retraction into the loss of both engines. The most damning detail came from the Antonov factory's own drawings. The original design had called for 2 separate grounding screws, so that if one ever failed, the other would still hold. Somewhere between the drawing board and the assembly line, that backup was quietly deleted, leaving a single screw standing between the airplane and catastrophe. There are few flights on Earth that feel safer than the hop from Moorea to Tahiti. It lasts about 7 minutes, barely long enough to settle into your seat, gliding across a turquoise lagoon between 2 of the most beautiful islands in the Pacific. Tourists took it without a second thought, the way most of us take a bus. The airline ran it around 40 times a day. In August 2007, that short and ordinary flight ended with 20 people at the bottom of the sea. The airplane was a de Havilland twin Otter, a small and rugged turboprop built for exactly this kind of work. But this one was tired. It had rolled out of the factory back in 1979 and had passed through the hands of several owners before Air Moorea bought it. By the summer of 2007, it was 28 years old, and it had been worked harder than almost any aircraft of its kind. On a route that short, a plane takes off and lands dozens of times a day, every single day. This twin Otter had done it more than 55,000 times. All that use fell hardest on a part most passengers never think about. Running back through the airplane were thin steel cables that connected the pilot's controls to the elevator on the tail, the surface that lets a plane climb and descend. At some point, the original cables had been swapped for stainless steel ones, chosen because they resisted the salt air better. But stainless steel had a weakness of its own. It wore down faster as it rubbed back and forth through its guides, and on an airplane that flew this often, that wear added up fast. The inspections never changed to keep pace, and deep inside the airframe, one of those cables was quietly fraying toward the breaking point. There may have been one more insult to that cable. When the twin Otter sat parked over at the big international airport on Tahiti, the report suggests it was caught in the jet blast of an airliner being pushed back nearby. The hurricane of exhaust set the little plane's elevator flapping against its stops, straining the cable that was already worn thin. Whatever the exact mix of causes, the result was the same. The cable was living on borrowed time, and no one knew. On the day it failed, Air Moorea Flight 1121 lifted off from Moorea with a single pilot and 19 passengers, climbing out over the water toward Tahiti. A minute into the flight, the pilot did the most routine thing imaginable. He brought up the flaps and eased back the power as the plane settled into its short cruise. With less lift, the nose dipped a little, so he pulled back on the controls to lift it again. That gentle pull was the final straw. The worn cable stretched and began to give way, and the elevator on the tail started to sag downward. The nose began to drop on its own, sinking toward the lagoon no matter what the pilot did. He hauled back on the controls, fighting for height, but the connection to the tail was already failing beneath his hands. At around 350 feet, the cable snapped clean through. With nothing left to hold it, the elevator swung fully nose down and locked the airplane into a dive. There was a cry of surprise in the cockpit, then the shriek of the ground proximity alarm, then nothing. Seconds later, the twin Otter struck the sea at tremendous speed, and all 20 people on board were lost. The wreckage came to rest on the sea floor more than 600 meters down, broken into pieces. It took divers and ships weeks to bring up enough of it to understand what had happened. The airplane had been fitted with a cockpit recorder, even though the law did not require one. That small choice, together with the recovered tail, gave investigators their answer. The control cable had failed. A worn-out part on a worn-out airplane had finally let go at the one moment its passengers needed it most. There is something especially cruel about this one. The flight was a 7-minute shuttle that thousands of people had taken in perfect safety, over water so calm and clear you could see the reef below. The pilot did nothing wrong, and the weather was flawless. The trap was simply the age of the machine, a single steel cable rubbed thin by one of the busiest little airplanes in the world. Run an aircraft hard enough for long enough, and eventually the thing that fails is not the engine or the weather. It is the airplane itself. A door should never be able to bring down an airplane. Yet that is exactly what happened over the English countryside in the summer of 1981, when a single baggage door tore one of Britain's own aircraft out of the sky. It is one of the strangest design failures in all of aviation, and it killed 3 people in barely 2 minutes. The airplane was a Hawker Siddeley 748, a rugged British turboprop built in the 1960s to fly off short and rough runways. It was a capable machine, but it was also famously over-engineered, packed with so many fiddly mechanical systems that the mechanics who maintained it often treated those systems as a running joke. This particular aircraft was 17 years old and spent its nights hauling mail. On the evening of its last flight, it carried a captain, a first officer, and a young postal assistant whose job was to ride in the back and watch over the cargo. The trouble was buried in the design of the baggage door. Like all doors on that aircraft, it opened outward, which meant it needed a complicated maze of claws, linkages, plungers, and warning systems to hold it shut against the pressure of the cabin. When everything was adjusted just right, the door was safe. When it was not, the design gave almost no honest sign of the danger. On this airplane, several small faults had quietly stacked up. One of the locking rods had been set to the wrong length, so the upper claws never quite reached their locked position. The little window over the door's status indicator had been fitted the wrong way round. Years of wear had rubbed away paint that was meant to mark the unsafe zone. The area was poorly lit. Add it all together, and when the postal assistant glanced at the indicator during loading, it looked for all the world like the door was locked. It was not. The aircraft took off with that door held shut by nothing more than a single pair of claws. Flight 240 climbed away from Gatwick and leveled at 10,000 feet, bound north with its load of mail. For most of the flight, the high cabin pressure actually helped, pressing the half-locked door against its frame. The danger came later. As the airplane began its descent and the pressure bled away, the delicate balance holding the door shut started to slip. The postal assistant was the first to notice. Crawling back to his seat over the mail pallets, he saw the door indicator now glowing red and hurried forward to warn the pilots. The captain knew at once this was serious. He slowed the airplane and leveled off, trying to limit the damage if the worst happened, and kept the assistant up front and away from the rear doors. For a few minutes it seemed they might hold it together. Then, descending through about 5,000 feet, the door let go. The cabin pressure blasted it clean off its hinges with a bang, and in a freak twist, the door flew back, folded perfectly in half around the leading edge of the tail, and jammed there. Of all the ways it could have fallen, it lodged itself in the one place that mattered most, right across the surface that controlled the airplane's pitch. The effect was immediate. The tail's airflow was wrecked, and the captain found himself wrestling a machine that no longer wanted to obey. He called for an emergency landing and fought to push the nose down toward the airport, but as the speed built, the crippled tail entered a zone of violent instability. The airplane began pitching wildly, swinging through angles no airframe was built to take. Within seconds, the forces were too much. Both wings tore away at once, and the aircraft broke apart in the sky above the village of Nailstone. There was nothing the crew could have done. From the moment that door wrapped around the tail, the flight was already lost. When investigators pieced it together, they uncovered something damning. This was not a freak one-off. The same door on this same type of aircraft had swung open in flight dozens of times over the previous 20 years, and on a handful of occasions, it had even struck the tail. Twice before, a door had lodged on the stabilizer exactly as it did here. Those crews survived only because it happened at low speed during climb, below the deadly zone. The warning signs had been scattered across 2 decades and several continents, and the manufacturer never connected them. We like to believe that an airplane is a finished thing, that once it rolls out of the factory and earns its certificate, the hard part is over, and from then on, the only real dangers come from the weather, the pilots, or simple bad luck. But every aircraft in this video tells a different truth. In each of these cases, the threat was not outside the machine, it was inside it all along. That is what makes these losses so unsettling. There was no thunderstorm to blame, no mountain in the fog, no obvious villain in the cockpit. The people on board did very little wrong. They trusted the aluminum and steel around them, exactly as we all do every time we step on a plane. And that trust was quietly betrayed by a flaw they could never have seen. Look at how small these flaws were. A single screw working itself loose, a seam of metal growing tired after too many years, a control cable rubbed thin, one short flight at a time, a door that was never quite designed to stay shut, a wing that could be shaken apart by nothing more than its own vibration. None of these things announce themselves. They hid behind fresh paint and clean cabins and confident smiles, waiting for the one moment when they would matter most. And that is the strange lesson buried in all of this. The machines we build to defy gravity are only ever as honest as their weakest part. A flaw in the design, or the slow wear of age, does not care how new the paint looks or how smooth the flight feels. When the hidden weakness finally gives way, it does so without warning, and often without mercy. But there is another side to every one of these videos. Each disaster left something behind. New rules, new inspections, new designs, and engineers who refuse to let the same thing happen twice. The cracks we now hunt for, the parts we now replace before they fail, the safeguards built into modern aircraft. So many of them exist because of the people lost in videos exactly like these. They did not die for nothing. The skies above us are safer today precisely because these airplanes were not. So the next time you settle into your seat and feel the engines spin up, remember how much quiet, painstaking work stands between you and the failures you just watched unfold. It is a remarkable thing that flying is as safe as it is. And it stayed that way because people kept asking the hard question that every aircraft in this video was forced to answer. What is hiding inside this machine that no one has found yet? That is all for this one. If you made it this far, odds are you love this kind of deep dive as much as we do. So hit subscribe and stick around. We have got a lot more of these coming, and the next one is never far behind.